Hi, everybody. We have a pretty unique opportunity today to be having some conversations with my sorority sister, Sarah Harring. Hi, Sarah.
Hi there.
Thanks for joining us. Sarah and I actually got to know one another through our sorority experiences, and I was serving on our council, right? And we met when I was working with your chapter a little bit. So
That's it.
Sarah did her undergraduate degree at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and then did her master's degree in student affairs at Ball State University. So she's been around a little bit, and now she is currently serving as a Title IX staff member at a higher education institute. So I was so happy to be able to reconnect with Sarah, and here we are. So we're gonna let Sarah give us some information today about Title IX, some of the latest happenings, and what is kind of going on in our legal system, how it's going to affect higher education overall as we try to navigate through a lot of information. So, Sarah, thanks for being with us. I'm really excited.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a great opportunity.
Yeah. So share with us a little bit about your background and how really you got into working with Title IX overall.
Sure. So, I always had a very strong desire, ever since really high school, to help victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. So during my undergrad, like you said at IUP, I went through about an 80-hour certificate course and started volunteering at our local domestic violence shelter. So that was kind of my first foot in the door. And then when I was applying to grad school, I was offered an assistantship in the Office of Victim Services at Ball State. So I basically functioned like an on-campus advocate who was confidential. And most of the time, the individuals that I worked with had experienced sexual misconduct of some kind. And that's right when like the It's On Us movement really began. And there was really a big push for addressing sexual misconduct on college campuses. So then after I left Ball State, I worked as a hall director at a school in Kentucky. And there I was really able to help like the RAs around programming related to sexual misconduct, and then coach them on how to handle disclosures, what support was available. And then my husband and I moved out to Colorado, and I fell into a pretty unique and interesting kind of dual position where I was working in both our Dean of Students office, so where student conduct lives, where our care team or our BIT team, that kind of behavioral intervention lived. But then I was also in our equity office. So that housed the policies for discrimination, harassment, sexual misconduct. So between those two offices, I was really able to learn this other side of how reports are received, the process for investigations, how sanctions might be determined. And this was really like the first place that I truly learned kind of the Title IX language and how offices that don't operate in that confidential space are really focused on the policy and the need to respond to those. So I was working there when the 2020 Title IX regulations were implemented, and I really played an integral role in updating our policies, our procedures to become compliant with those. And I took on like even more responsibilities within that equity side. So that's kind of like the way that I got to where I am, and then kind of my background into how I got interested in it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing. And I feel like a lot of times with higher education in general, you don't think about going into your specific area, right? Until you dig through some different areas. So I can certainly appreciate that. And I never thought, I was a paralegal major undergrad. So here I am working in fraternity sorority life and working in res life. And it's just really my undergraduate experience kind of pointed me in this direction. So I think it's always unique. People's stories kind of, help us understand a little bit more about each piece of higher ed, because it's such a large beast, and it's different at every institution. So thank you so much for sharing your background a little bit. So, what does your work look like today? And what are you working through, or how have you continued to learn more about everything that's happening? And just give us some more information about yourself.
Yeah. So last summer, I really started a job search. We thought that it was time to move back to family.
I'm sorry, y'all. My dog heard the truck outside.
That's okay. Our dogs are very protective.
Go ahead. Sorry. I'll get him there, hopefully.
So last summer, I really started a job search. It was time to move back east to our family. And I was really looking at a lot of different options. And to be honest, I was a little burned out from my previous position. I didn't really know if I wanted to stay in higher ed. But I found this position as a Title IX case manager at the institution I'm working at now. And my current role kind of touches on a little bit of everything within the Title IX office. But my main focus is really our data management. So every time our office receives a report, it's documented within our case management system, and a lot of people might have their hands on a case as it moves through our office. But like any other office, we need to be able to report out on statistics, and I really ensure that we're documenting everything appropriately. So on the outside, it may seem pretty straightforward, but when you work in that compliance office in that realm, you need to make sure that every case file is complete. And I'm kind of that second pair of eyes on dedicated to making sure that happens. So, but when I'm not working on the case management, I am also meeting with complainants or respondents. So complainant is the person that's bringing a complaint forward, respondent, the one that's responding to a complaint. I help with trainings, and really the other half of my job is focused on being our hearing administrator. So when an investigation goes to a hearing, I'm the one really doing the logistics of planning and the preparation to make sure that that part of the process goes smoothly.
Okay. Great. I mean, not great because you're dealing with a lot of hard stuff, right? But great because you have the good experience. So in respect to some of the most recent legislation, talk to me more about some of the legislation that's been happening in regard to Title IX, what that looks like, what has changed, and or what's happening out there, basically.
Yeah, so when you asked me to be on this podcast, I thought to myself, I know the work that I do, and I know kind of the history, but I did my own little deep dive for you just because I wanted to be like, what truly happened between 2011 and now.
Right.
So the first thing that I'll say is, Title IX was enacted in 1972. So we're coming up on 50 years, which is a huge deal. But it was 1975 that like the first regulations of Title IX were reinforced. So there were no regulations in that case on how to address sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination. So whenever it was first brought up, it was really just discrimination as in general. It wasn't until like the late 90s that the department really started to address guidance documents on how schools, how universities should really be handling this stuff. So there were a few guidance things that came out. So there's one in 2001. There was the really prominent 2011 Dear Colleague letter, which was the Obama administration. There was a 2014 question and answer that was also under Obama. And then some things came out in 2017. And the thing that we need to remember about guidance is that it's not really enforceable. So it's not the law of the land. It's just, here are some things that we think that you should do. You should follow these. So
sorry to interrupt you. I think at the time, you're talking about the time, all of that time I was working in Res Life.
Mhm.
and with a conduct office in student affairs, but so much was going on at that point in time. And even though it wasn't law, right? That was the first time that we did anything that kind of directed us in any kind of a way that would give us information, or that there was maybe a more standardized way to work through any kind of investigative process.
That's exactly right.
Sorry.
Yeah, and in 2011, there were a lot of critics that came out to say that a lot of schools were developing inequitable processes, that there was bias in the process, that it was specifically working against respondents, and that there wasn't enough due process involved. Um, and so when Trump was inaugurated, that was 2017. So by that fall, he had withdrawn everything that the Obama administration had put out there, and his administration put out their own guidelines. And a year later is when they really started the process of proposing regulations, which is a very rigorous process. It's a legal process to really put something into law. And they sent out these proposed regulations, and it was reviewed by almost everyone across the country. They received over 120,000 written responses to them. And then they went through a revisal process. So from 2018 to May of 2020, the Department of Education was working on that. In May 2020, the final regulations were released. And at that point, we were told that it needed to be effective by August 14th. So that's a very short amount of time to make very big changes. And this was really the first time that, like I said, the regulations imposed those legally binding rules. But it was specifically in respect to responding to sexual harassment, which again, it had only been guidance before. So this was the first time that sexual harassment was actually included into Title IX. And really the critics of these regulations have said that the pendulum has now swung too far in favor of respondents by either requiring institutions to have direct cross-examination through live hearings, narrowing the definition of sexual harassment, limiting the extent to which campuses can, or the extent to which the regulations cover off-campus conduct. So just like there are critics of 2011, there's critics of 2020. There was over 2,000 pages of explanation, or what they call the preamble of the regulation, to kind of go through, these are all the comments we received, this is how we decided on these, this is the feedback that we got, and here's how we're going to include it or disregard it. But there's only about 30 pages of like specific regulations, specific rules. So then institutions spent the summer basically redoing their policies, their procedures, and you really had to implement, a lot of places had to implement a specific Title IX hearing structure for the very first time. Our conduct officers are used to having some sort of hearing or a board or something to that effect. But before, we didn't necessarily need to go through that process. It could have been just an investigation and a decision made. So when Biden was inaugurated in January 21.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second just because I have a question along with what you just explained. So the conduct process, I guess, was it campus-based decisions about how that conduct process would run up until that point? And
yes.
Then once those regulations came out, then there was a detailed process for what all campuses needed to follow in terms of putting together a conduct process for any kind of sexual misconduct.
That's correct. Yeah. Before it was very campus specific of this is how we're going to adjudicate, this is how we're going to do this. So some campuses were already doing hearings.
Sure.
I remember Ball State would do some sexual misconduct hearings, but for the most part, a lot of people needed to implement an entirely new process.
Mm-hmm.
So when Biden was inaugurated, January, in March, he gave an executive order to say that, the education department needed to review all the existing regulations, orders, guidance, to make sure that what was put out in 2020, they still agreed with. So that's what we're waiting on now. So Biden signed this, they're going through a process, and now we've been told that the Department of Ed is supposed to be releasing new proposed regulations because of that executive order. So we don't know exactly what we're going to be doing yet, but the Department of Ed has been working on that.
So those regulations that came out then in 2020 under the Trump administration, those are still in place now until we get updated regulation or guidelines? Or
it could be both. Yeah, so we could get interim guidance, which is actually what happened this past August. The Department of Education released a letter guiding our institutions that after a federal court in Massachusetts saw an issue, a case was brought forward by several organizations and individuals challenging the 2020 regulations. A lot of places, a lot of institutions were doing that across the country. But Massachusetts, actually, the court upheld most of it, but they made one determination related to the live hearing process. And the Department of Education decided to follow that court order, and they ceased their enforcement of one specific part. And it was that part that prohibited statements that weren't subject to cross-examination could be used to make a decision. So what that means is prior to that change, in order for statements or evidence to be considered, the person who submitted them needed to participate in live cross-examination. If they didn't, then the decision maker couldn't rely on that evidence at all to reach a determination. So they've changed that to say, like, if somebody doesn't show up to a hearing, the decision maker can still use that evidence and that information, but they can decide what weight, what credibility to give to it. So the department can do things like that and issue guidance and letters. These new proposed regulations are going to be the first time that our offices will now be seeing what the new structure of the Department of Education is thinking based on their review.
Okay, that's definitely different than what I remember in the conduct process for sure. And I do think, I will say, the institution that I was working for at the time when the Dear Colleague letter originally had come out, like I do think we were very progressive in our approach, and we were a campus that did put a lot of those processes in place. So I'm sure, I mean, I haven't worked there for several years now, but I'm sure those have been updated and will continue to be updated over time. So we are gonna come right back with Sarah.
Excellent.
Okay, we're back with Sarah. So with all of that information, can you talk about, or do you have any idea of what some of the changes may be that we could expect from the Biden administration moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that when we were looking at the 2020 regulations, there were some rumblings of what changes could potentially be, but that's not really the case this time around. I feel like a lot of us are kind of in the dark of what could potentially be coming out. So we really don't know, but I think some things that they might be focusing on are a redefinement of sexual harassment, updates to the hearing procedures, kind of like that Massachusetts court decided. It could also include ways to prevent sexual harassment, because that's something that kind of fell off the radar in the regulations. It doesn't really say how you can address it on campus. It doesn't say that you can't, it just doesn't give you any guidance on like what that might look like for schools. So all I know for sure is that it's probably going to be a very lengthy process again, because it has to go through all the legal steps once again. But this was kind of the first step to critically evaluate what was already put in place.
Okay. And I know you've said this a few times that these regulations, right? I want to make sure that I'm using the right terminology, that we received were concerned more with sexual harassment and the definitions of sexual harassment. So is sexual misconduct not appropriate terminology any longer? Does that fall under sexual harassment? Is that an umbrella term? Like,
yeah,
that was the terminology.
That's a great question. So sexual harassment is a form of sex-based harassment. And it has a few categories right now. Okay. So one, it has quid pro quo as its own specific category. So an employee offering something to a student or another person in exchange for sexual conduct. It has unwelcome conduct that a reasonable person would find so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies that person equal access. So that's something that changed, is that before it could have been severe, pervasive, or objectively offensive, but now it needs to meet all three.
That's a big
difference. That's a big difference. Okay. And it also has the legal definitions of sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. So sexual harassment needs to fall within one of those categories. Okay. But also under Title IX, it's specifically related to conduct that occurs within an educational program or activity in the United States. And there's one other thing. So if conduct occurs off campus in a house that somebody is renting as a student, that's not on campus conduct. And it's not conduct that happens within your educational program or activity. So within Title IX, it would need to be dismissed. Within universities' policies, they might extend their jurisdiction, or they might have a separate non-Title IX sexual misconduct policy, or they might tell our conduct folks that they can hear that case, which gets into some muddy waters. So we're hoping to have a little bit more on the definitions themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, that's interesting to me, because I remember sitting down with committees and trying to come up with our university definitions for each one of those things. Again, this was 10 years ago now, but I think it's good that we're getting a specific definition. I don't like the off-campus stuff. That's my personal opinion. Just because I feel like, then does that make it okay? Does someone automatically have to go to the police instead of going through their university? So I just think it brings up a whole slew of other questions. I'm sorry, my dogs clearly are barking or fighting in the background. That's what you hear, the growling. if you're listening. So with that, how may some of those changes impact the work that y'all are doing? I mean, any Title IX office is doing with cases on their campuses, within their communities. Can we kind of expect, again, the huge sweeping changes? Do we anticipate that, or is it just?
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting, because as we go through these updates again, campus policies and procedures are likely going to change again. So just like the last regulations, there are certain discretionary changes that universities will probably have the autonomy to make. And universities really will have to take the time to see if their policies still align or if they want to make any changes. So that autonomy is really like for instance, the off-campus. If you want to extend your jurisdiction now and still hear that case, university can definitely do that. So that autonomy on those discretionary things will be interesting to see how much leeway these new regulations will allow for.
Is there any information out there that gives us detail about what campuses may or may not adjudicate any kind of sexual harassment claims or misconduct issues that come forward off campus versus on campus? Or is that get automatically reported in Clery also?
Yeah, so Clery and Title IX are very different. We handle a lot of the same cases, but the cases that we take are different. So while Clery is, again, on campus or public property, it may also be that we know about things that wouldn't be Clery defined, but could still be adjudicated or investigated through the university. So I think it's interesting the way that campuses set up those policies, and how they choose to make those decisions.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for a campus too, on a large campus, depending on the size of an office, you don't know how many people you're going to have to even take care of cases that might come in from off campus. And then how do you decide what gets handled and what doesn't get handled? That makes it discretionary. And then is that fair? Like, there's so many, like, I have a paralegal background. Clearly my mind just goes in a bunch of different directions with that also. So I can only imagine.
Yeah, that's something that I go back to all the time, is what does our policy say, and how are we doing that across the board?
Absolutely. Cool. Well, is there anything else that you foresee on the horizon for us with the legislation?
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit, not necessarily legislation, but I was thinking a little bit about our informal discretionary, our alternative resolution discretionary policies, because the regulations said that you can implement a informal process, and there was kind of like a big push for implementing restorative justice practices and principles into those informal resolution of complaints. So they said that restorative justice was one avenue that you could explore, and a lot of people kind of jumped on that. So I actually got my certificate in restorative justice facilitation and leadership last year, and I think, you know, when it's done correctly, it can be a great alternative for individuals who don't really want to go through the full investigation and the hearing process itself. Because RJ really focuses on, you know, identifying the harms that are caused. How do we repair those harms? So sometimes when a complainant just wants an acknowledgement of a harm, and maybe, you know, a stipulation of education or counseling or something to that degree, they can really agree on those terms through that informal resolution. So it gets to the outcome somebody's looking for by reporting without needing to go through the process, the full investigation process. And they built in that it needs to be mutually agreed upon. Both parties need to voluntarily consent to it. So there are things built in that it's not like the respondent is pressured into this, or or the complainant even is pressured into it. It's just another avenue that people can explore and take. And I don't think a lot of institutions have the bandwidth to offer things like that. Or they might not know how to do those processes well, or
and I think that's a complete like campus integration, honestly, because you can come up with a bunch of different things that somebody could be doing or conversations that folks could have, but depending on the circumstances, right? It could involve a bunch of different offices. And if you're looking for help, then those offices need to be kept up to date on what's going on. And then I understand the concept. I just think sometimes the creation of those standards campus-wide can be challenging to implement.
Yeah. You need a lot of people on board and a lot of people to buy in.
Yeah, it's a complicated system. So talk to me a little bit about some of the tips and tricks that you may have used or learned while working through some Title IX cases, your own experiences.
Yeah, I'd really say the first tip is that your policy is your best friend, for better or worse. Because whenever you work with a Title IX office or compliance individuals, they'll often refer to the policy or quote the policy. And it really is that roadmap that outlines what you can and what you can't do. And then if you can do it, how to do those things. So that's why when everything is verbally said, or even especially written out, it should be backed up by the policy, because when deviations happen, that's when you really open up your office for legal concerns, and nobody wants to deal with that. So policy is number one. Second, I was really thinking about, empathy and communication are the biggest traits that I think someone working in Title IX can have, because you often learn about individuals' most private and personal experiences, and just them being willing to share those experiences with you is a big feat. So, you can obviously imagine that empathy is key to listening and offering support, and especially to the complainants that come forward first. But Title IX is often also that neutral office, and we offer that same support and resources to the respondents. Mm-hmm. So you really need to learn to empathize with both parties. And whenever I work with respondents, I've seen them be blindsided by a report, and you need to really understand that the Title IX process can be just as difficult on them going through it. So there's empathy, but then also you need to communicate these really complex policies and procedures in an easily digestible way. And, some students, if they have the means, they might get an attorney involved, or if they feel supported by their parents, they might get them involved. But others are just navigating these processes on their own or with minimal support. And it can be really scary going through that process alone. So, being able to communicate that so that anyone can understand. But then what happens when a complainant comes to you and maybe their experience doesn't meet that definition of Title IX, like we were talking about earlier, like it doesn't meet the threshold for sexual harassment, or you don't take cases that happen off campus. You really need to learn how to communicate like that the behavior wasn't good and the experience wasn't okay, but it doesn't fall within that legal definition. So it's Title IX is really just about hard conversations
Yeah,
and how to navigate them.
yeah, absolutely. And that's something I think, especially coming out of COVID, I say coming out and hoping, right?
Right.
But coming out of COVID for students, really, or probably young professionals too, like everybody has been in such a technological running of their lives, right? Whether it's Zoom or chat features, email, like all of those things, and really having that live in-person conversation, and especially with a difficult conversation like that, can for sure be challenging for some folks along the way. So just another thing to think about as we're kind of navigating through this process. So this is very complex. Like I've been out of the world for so long, so I'm learning as you're talking, but I remember feeling like it was complex, and it still is, even more so now probably. So that's tough. So looking to wrap up a little bit, any advice for campuses that may be looking to initiate some best practices within their management of Title IX cases? I know you said you're working with a whole bunch of data, but what may that look like, or any thoughts that you could give on that?
So obviously this is a little bit resource dependent. Not every institution is going to have the means to implement some things, and case management systems are a great tool. They can help with documentation and those analytics, but not everyone can afford those systems. They get pretty expensive. So I also think that Excel and institutional drives or cloud drives can work just as well when you're managing the cases that come in. But I think no matter what system you use, it's really important that everyone on your team is well versed in how your team is managing them, where to find case information, what specifically needs to be documented. Oftentimes when we work in those compliance and those conduct offices, we might get subpoenaed or we might get a records request, which usually have a tight turnaround time. So making sure that you know what's documented and where is going to make any of those processes a lot easier. And then I really think that there's a bigger push now for transparency and statistics. So I'd really suggest offices think about what data they're capturing, whether that's demographic or case turnaround time, or it could be, well, it should be the types of cases that come in. There's a lot of things that you can collect data on, but whenever you think about it, you should think about what you're capturing, how you're planning to use it, and then how can you explain it to outside stakeholders? Because if you release information, there's only a very small group of people that would actually understand what that means. So how do you explain it? How do you make sure that when numbers don't add up, that you have an explanation? A great example of this is, a report can come in and it could fall under 2 or 3 categories. So you might classify it as all 3 of those things. So when you have 100 reports, but you have 110, classifications of those cases, that's not going to add up. It adds up to the office, but it's important to know how you're going to explain that to other people.
Yeah, and I remember even when I was working in Res Life, we went over to a case management system, and it was like a year-long process to get everything up and running. And I know then pulling information to report out that Clery data was a lot simpler, because I remember we used to have to report every kind of case by case under a specific category before we went to the case management system. So I know that is definitely a cumbersome transition, but not having it also, I mean, it's doable. We did it. Again, it was a long time ago. I think there are different places out there now. but yeah, I learned a lot throughout that process for sure. Great. Well, thank you. Any final thoughts that you may have in regard to legislation, tips, tricks, advice, suggestions along the way, anything like that?
Yeah, I just always like to acknowledge how difficult the work of Title IX is for the professional staff, but also how difficult it is for anyone that's going through a Title IX process. So I don't know if that'll ever get easier, but I personally believe in the work of Title IX and really hope that we can continue to enhance the protections that it affords.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it. I hope that this information was good for our listeners, and I hope that people are taking back some information to their campuses, or even just a stronger knowledge base as things continue to progress with legislation. Hopefully we'll get some of those recommendations out sooner rather than later, right? And I hope it's not another quick turnaround time for my friends who are working on campuses either. So thank you so much, Sarah. Have a great rest of your night. I appreciate you chatting for a little while.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Sure.